All right, welcome folks to Last Week I Learned with Jimmy Cerrone. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we're going to be walking through 5 articles I found that I enjoyed this week, and we're going to talk a little bit about an idea of the week. So without further ado, we'll start with Friday Finds. This is the first article. It's actually a newsletter that I really enjoy. It's a lot like my own newsletter. He finds, I think it's just 5 things from across the internet that week that he really enjoyed. This one's a really wide-ranging one, but what I found most kind of compelling was an article about the growth of prestige as just a concept in American life. And so here's a quick quote. He says, he argues that there's a surplus of smart young Americans fighting for admissions to the same elite colleges and graduates fighting for the same prestigious jobs. Scott Galloway wrote a great article called More about this, and I think it's just so important, right? This idea that we are creating artificial constraints on how many people can go to the top schools and how many people can get the top jobs. And it's really choking out so much talent. We're leaving so much on the table, and it's so very wasteful. And it's a real tragedy. And I think when we imagine a better world for America, I think part of it has to be creating more opportunities for people. And we've really found some great success. Scott Galloway talks about there's this vaccine that lowers depression, that increases earnings over time, that helps create more stable marriages. And it's education. If we could put education in a pill, we would give it to everybody. And we need to take the same approach to actual education and start to think about how to make it more accessible and widespread. And I think, to be honest, it's something we can all get behind. Is we live in such a divided, polarized world. I think so many of us can really get on board with the idea that a great education is priceless. And so I'm excited to think about more and more people getting on board with this and kind of creating nodes of people working towards it. So that's the big takeaway. But I also really loved in Friday Finds, there was a great take on ChatGPT, which I'm always looking for. And then he mentions Nassim Taleb, one of my favorite authors and thinkers. So a lot in that one. Next up is optimistic nihilism. Right, so this is an article about a philosophy that I don't fully agree with, but I find it very interesting, right? So I think often, in my experience, you have optimists are either, kind of like creative types or religious, I think. And there's kind of failure modes with each of those, right? I think sometimes folks who are religious can become dogmatic. Folks who are on that creative spectrum can become almost universalist without really strong values or strong selection mechanisms for anything. And so what I think is really interesting is to combine optimism with nihilism, which is, my definition, probably incorrect, is there's no meaning. And it's kind of the opposite of what you would normally associate with an optimist. And I don't fully agree with this perspective, but I think it's really fascinating. It's a really interesting take. And I loved reading it. This person really well thought out, really interesting, and I think it's worth taking a look at. Next up is tasks, lists, and promises. Now, I was just stunned by this. I've read lots of books about task management. I've read The Bullet Journal, Getting Things Done with David Allen. I've done a lot of thinking here, and I've never come across something this calm and simple. I loved it. I am going to be rereading it. I actually have a to-do to reread this. My biggest takeaway was that priority actually doesn't matter. Dependency is what matters. What depends on what? So once you have a goal, it doesn't matter that one task is higher priority than the other. What matters is which can be done first. Right? If you have a really high priority task, but it depends on a low priority one, you still have to do the low priority one first. And I think it's really simplifying and takes a lot of stress out. Also, as a side note, I really encourage you to explore that blog. The author is incredible, has lots of great thoughts on all kinds of things. I have bookmarked, I think, almost everything they wrote. All right, number 4, why you should join Pinecone. This is a little bit more of a serious, kind of useful one. I think a lot of times on this newsletter, I'm trying to throw things out that maybe challenge me or push me in some strange direction that's kind of unpredictable. This one, though, is, I think, really utilitarian. So if you've noticed, I try to kind of stay away from AI hype cycle in general. There's a great newsletter I follow called Dense Discovery that talks about they're kind of taking a similar tact. They're like, this is just a hype cycle. There's so much there. it's tough to sift through and figure out what is actually valuable and useful. And I'm trying to take that same approach. So this one I think is worth paying attention to. This is called Why You Should Join Pinecone. Pinecone is a company that is selling the shovels and pickaxes of the gold rush that is AI. And they're worth paying attention to. I don't know if Pinecone will be the company that breaks through, but what they're doing is so important, and it's a really great way to understand AI in general. So what Pinecone is doing is they're building the backbone of large language models. So basically, at their heart, what a large language model is it's taking text and it's converting it into numbers, right? So it's taking all these words that have lots of meaning to us, and it's basically collapsing it into a ton of numbers that represent the meaning of the text, right? There's some model behind the scenes that says, okay, this is this kind of tone, this is this kind of meaning, these words are related in this way, right? It's just numericizing, I guess that's a word, text, basically, at its heart. And what Pinecone does is it's the database for that, right? These kind of maps of meaning of numbers are really difficult to store. It's really complicated. It's hard to do it quickly. There's a lot of complexity here, and Pinecone is right at the heart of it. They're building basically databases just for these large language models. And what they're doing is fascinating and really worth understanding. And if you understand this, you really go a long ways towards understanding large language models. So let's see. Last one. Walk with one of LA's top foragers as he picks his meal on the mountainside. I've been trying to get back into foraging. I did it when I lived on a mountain in Oregon. I found it incredibly freeing. It's so cool to realize that food is all around you. I grew up, you go to the grocery store for food and that's about it. I grew up around farmland, but I never really went there, and grew up around huge commercial farms where you don't really go in and pick corn or soy off, the stalk. And when I went to Oregon, it was very different. It was a small scale organic farming. We were constantly eating out of the garden. And the harvest was huge. It was just interesting, huge for me, but felt like a bounty of different kinds of food. And while I was there, though, what I realized and started to put together with help from professors is there was food also growing just around. Our organic garden was effectively replicated in quote-unquote nature, whatever you define nature to be, right? There were wild blackberries, there were plums, there were roots that I could eat. There was mint growing that I could use, just around. And I've always left that kind of knowledge in Oregon, and I'm starting to realize that Los Angeles has a lot of edible foods around as well. And so I'm trying to think about how can I get to know them? How can I harvest them and use them? It's really sad. There's a lot of waste, right? Because one of my neighbors, he's got a peach tree. He's going to get 70 pounds of peaches, and it's hard to use that many. And so I think there's a lot of interesting things that could happen with all these wonderful fruit trees that grow in Los Angeles, whether that be kind of helping supplement homeless shelters, food, because it's difficult to get fresh food there, or even just, for myself, learning to connect better with the city. So I highly recommend you dig into this person who is featured in the article. They have a great book about foraging and how to cook with foraged food. Someday when I am not banned from buying cookbooks, which I am for right now because I keep buying them, I will get that cookbook and check it out. But that is leading nicely into the idea of the week, which is the power of place. So I went to Phoenix last week, one of the hottest weeks on record. And I think for most people that would repel them from Phoenix, but for me, it really attracted me to it because it felt like getting to know the power of Phoenix, right? Phoenix is known for its heat, and I want to understand how that shapes a place and a culture and a people. And I think it's fascinating in a world that appears to be globalizing, where things appear to be more and more similar, right? There's Starbucks everywhere, there's McDonald's everywhere. Geography doesn't care, and it still exerts pressure on places. And I really saw this while reading Krakatoa, and it was so interesting to see the reaction of the Dutch versus the Indonesians there in Jakarta. It was fascinating to see the difference, right? Because the Dutch were relative newcomers, the Indonesians really understood the place. And I think in a world where we have air conditioning and, building structures that are relatively similar, like everything's getting more uniform, I think sometimes we can forget how our physical area affects us, how it changes us. One of the things that I loved about LA was that you can be outside all the time, right? Compared to Michigan, you're inside 3 or 4 months a year. And even in Phoenix, right? During the summer, you're inside most of the day. And it's just different. You get into different habits because you can always be outside in Los Angeles, right? I'm in the habit of going on lots of walks, in the habit of, catching up with friends outside. It's just different. The way you think about everything is different. And so this week I just wanted to reflect on that. And I'd love to hear how your place affects you. I think there's just so much variance that is easy to miss, especially in a remote world where we don't even work in the same place, how different our routines, our lives, our cultures are based on where we live physically. So that is it for this week. Thank you so much for joining me on Last Week I Learned. It's been great to have you.